everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and today we're doing yet another top 30 of my favorite games on each console. And today we're doing the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. Yeah, I figured I'd combine the two together, since the Game Boy Color library is not nearly as big, and if I tried doing these lists separately, it would be kind of a pain. And just like the other lists that I've done, I'm only going to be doing one game per franchise, because I think it'd be kind of boring if I just listed like 5 games within the same series. And I like to try to mention different variety of different games, series, and genres. And of course, just because I rank a game higher than another game doesn't mean I think it's 100% better than everything that came before it. This is pretty much just a giant recommendation list of games that I do really enjoy and that do make up my personality. So that's really all I have to say on that. So for now, let's just get right to it. So number 30 we have is Mercenary Force. Now this is a pretty interesting shoot 'em up for one, it doesn't take place in space for the millionth frickin' time. So instead you're using different ninjas and samurais and the like, and of course you pick out your party with different ones that you want, and all these characters have different shots and how much hit points they can take. And as you're shooting everything in sight, the other button allows you to change formation, which allows you to not only shoot at different angles, but also that you don't get hit as much. And that's kind of the main challenge of the game, is just trying to figure out like what is the best time to switch to different formations. It's pretty interesting. And sometimes along the level you can go into a store and buy like newer items and such, which is also pretty nifty as well. So yeah, this is a pretty unique shoot 'em up that I like quite a bit for that it's pretty quirky, and it also is pretty addicting as well. And I will say right now that yeah, there's going to be a lot of games on this list that I do consider to be addicting, because that's the thing about the Game Boy and what worked for me is that there's just a lot of fun, simple, addicting games. And as for number 29, we have is Nail and Scale. Now this is a game that really took me by surprise, and yeah, just like I said, this is another one of those games that's just very simple, but yet very addicting for me. It's a puzzle platformer where you throw nails on the wall, and then you jump on them, and you can use those for leverages. And the levels in this game are pretty short, so every time you beat one, you just want to keep going. Hence why I said that this is a simple, addicting game, and I kinda love it for that. So yeah, I actually find this to be a very underrated one. And at number 28, we have is Hammer and Harry Ghost Building Company, and many times I almost said Ghost Busting Company, which would have been pretty funny. But anyways, yes, so this is a part of a pretty long-running series called Hammer and Harry, where you're a construction worker who likes to beat the crap out of things with a hammer, so you know, what's not to love about that. And every time you upgrade your hammer in this game, it gets bigger with more range, and it's much stronger as well. But on top of having some action platforming levels, there is some shoot 'em up levels as well. And I will say, as much as I do really like this game, it is pretty tough, as I do feel like that whenever you do get hit by something, you usually power down, which can make certain bosses a lot harder. But thankfully, you do get a decent amount of health. So yeah, for a Game Boy version of a series that was in like the arcade and the NES and many other platforms, I actually think it is a pretty good one. And as for number 27, we have is Final Fantasy Legends 2. Which is technically not even really a Final Fantasy game, it's actually a Saga game, disguised as a Final Fantasy game, because, you know, it was just the way how things were back then. And the funny thing is for me, even to this day, this is still the only Saga game that I've ever played. Yeah, I know I'm slacking on that stuff, but you know, what can I say, there's like a bajillion RPGs out there, it's kinda hard to play them all. But yeah, this is a game I did own pretty early on, and I do remember playing it quite a bit, even though I did suck at it as a kid, because I always made, like, the worst party ever. Yeah, this is one of those games where you have many different options to create your party, like, you got robots, you got aliens, you got like a slime monster, and you got some other like humans and elves and such. Yeah, there's a lot of different options that you can take, with some very interesting results. And I always really like the music in this game. I actually think it's a really good soundtrack for Game Boy. And the sprite work for Game Boy standards were also really good too. So whether it be a Final Fantasy game or not, I do think it is a pretty cool one. And at number 26, we have is Roland's Curse 2. I have played both of these games, but I like the second one more as it did have some better speed to the game. But yeah, this is a top-down Zelda-style game where you get to play as Roland, which, of course, every time I think of that name, I can't help but think of Dark Tower now. But yeah, you just play as a knight who just has to run around and beat things up with a sword, you know, the usual stuff. But the thing that does make this game pretty cool is the fact that you actually have different characters that join your party, and they have different ways of attacking. Which I really do like the idea of having a top-down Zelda game with a party system of switching between different characters. And I also like the game's different set pieces you get to go to. I especially really like the graveyard looking level. So if you do want a Zelda-style game that is not Zelda, I do think this is a pretty good alternative that was pretty enjoyable. And as for number 25, we have our very first Game Boy Color game on this list, and that is Shantae. Now, while this game may be pretty well known now, mainly because it made a comeback and had a whole bunch of sequels and other games and spin-offs and whatnot, which is pretty interesting how that came about, but back in the day, this game was very overlooked to the point that it barely sold and it eventually became a very rare collector's item. And believe it or not, I actually was aware of this game for that it actually did have a little bit of coverage in one of the Nintendo Power magazines I had. And I do remember thinking that the game looked really cool with its nice graphics, but of course, just like most people, I didn't buy it. Oh, the problems of being a kid with no money when you couldn't afford to buy every single game that looked interesting. But anyways though, I have played it now, and yeah, this game is actually really good. I do really enjoy this one, as it is a pretty fun Metroid-style game. Even though I suck at these games, I still appreciate a lot of things that it does for that. Like I said, the graphics are really nice, the music is really catchy and fun, but the boss fights are pretty fun, and I do like some of the power-ups that you get as well. And lastly I'll mention is that the game has some pretty amusing humor, which I do like. So yeah, even with its humble little origins, I still think it's a really good game. And as for number 24, we have is Return of the Ninja. Now this game is related to the NES game Shadow of the Ninja, and they both happen to be published by Natsume, and it's a fast-paced action platformer with ninjas. Now, it may sound like Ninja Gaiden, but I feel like that the flow of gameplay is very different from that. So while it may look like a very similar game to it, it does feel a lot different when it comes to the controls, the level layouts, and just the stuff that you can do. So it still has its own identity, and I do think it is a pretty enjoyable one. And I also do find this game to be pretty difficult personally, although not on the same level as Ninja Gaiden, but it does have its own unique challenges. So yeah, for a random follow-up game, I do think it is a pretty well-made one on the Game Boy Color. And as for number 23, we have is Mole Mania. I remember the first time I saw this game, I thought it was like a Kirby spin-off because the art style of the game does look very Kirby-like. But nah, instead you play as a mole where you just gotta dig underground and try to get through these mazes, and the whole gimmick of the game is that you have to try to dig underground and then back up and then down again. Yeah, it's very puzzle-like, where you gotta throw rocks around as well, and you gotta, like, defeat all the enemies in every area to clear it. Yeah, it's that kind of game. And as I said, very simple, very fun and addicting. Also, there's really not that many games I can think of where you get to play as a mole, which is pretty unique within itself. And as for number 22, we have is Wacky Races. And believe it or not, this one is actually a racing game. Yeah, because for those that don't know, the one on NES is a game that I really love a lot, but it's not a racing game, which is kind of weird. So, anyways, with all that aside though, this game is surprisingly really well made for a random license game. Not only does the graphics look really impressive for the Game Boy Color, but also the game's controls are really well made, like they're not slippery at all. And there's a couple different game modes which are pretty interesting, where obviously you got the arcade mode, but then you have endurance mode, which is a mode where whoever's in last place will get eliminated and the race just keeps going until there's only one left. So that's something I was not expecting this game to have, and it's done really well too. So that's two games that are based after the Wacky Races cartoon that are damn good. And as for number 21, we have is Samurai Kid. Now this is a Japan-only game that I have reviewed on the channel many years ago. So obviously I'm not going to go into everything here, but to sum it up is that it's a side-scrolling platformer with some puzzle elements, where you usually have to put blocks on top of switches and you have different items such as a sword, a U-tan, and a fan. And as again, it's another one of those games that's just very simple but also very easy to pick up and play, and it's kind of addicting. And lastly, before moving on, is that this game was actually published by Koei, which is interesting because, you know, you don't really make a lot of games like this, which is always fascinating to learn about their random other games that they've done. And as for number 20, we have is Lock and Chase. So this game is pretty much Pac-Man, but if he looked like a 1920s gangster, which I think is pretty fun looking, but of course the main difference with this game is the fact that you can actually close off different gates and walls to block off some of the police officers that are chasing after you while you're trying to collect all the dots and the money and such. And yeah, I've always really liked this one. It's just a very fun, simple, pick up and play kind of game, you know, like I've been saying before. And of course, I don't really need to go into detail what Pac-Man is, as I'm sure you all know what that is. But yeah, I think it's a pretty amusing and fun alternative to that. And as for number 19, we have is Last Bible 2. So this is our Shin Megami Tensei pick for this one, and there's not that many games on the Game Boy or Game Boy Color, but it is interesting to note that Last Bible 2 actually has both a Game Boy and a Game Boy Color version. I'm not entirely sure if there's any, like, major differences between the two, obviously, other than, like, the fact that one's in color and the other is not, but yes, I played the Game Boy Color version, and yeah, I actually really like this one. It is a bit of a more lighthearted version of a typical SMT game, although not on the same level as Demi Kids, but it's kind of a happy medium between Demi Kids and a mainline SMT game. So you have your main character, who can capture demons and can also fuse with them and whatnot, but then you also do have some other human characters that do join your party, and you venture around in a fantasy world, where most Shin Megami Tensei games usually take place in like a post-apocalyptic cyberpunk world, sort of. But yeah, I do find this to be a pretty chill RPG, nothing super crazy, it's pretty easy to pick up and play and know what you're doing. And for a random spin-off series that was short-lived, I do find this one does have its charms that does make it pretty enjoyable. And as for number 18, we have is Yu-Gi-Oh! Dark Duel Stories. This was a game that I remember my cousin gave me, and I remember really liking it, even though the rulings of this game are very strange. Yeah, this is one of those games that belongs into the early experimental Yu-Gi-Oh! Days. But it's kind of hard to explain all of that because, you know, I'd have to literally explain how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! And well, you know, I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to this that don't give a shit about that. But with that being said though, I do find this to be a pretty enjoyable game once you do know some of the rulings of it, and also it has a really good soundtrack, and also the other interesting thing about this game is that it actually has a card creator in there, which is a feature that I don't think is in any other Yu-Gi-Oh! Game as far as I know. And that right there I do think is pretty awesome, even though it obviously is very limited in what you can do with it, but it's still cool the fact that it even has one. And as for number 17, we have is Kirby's Dream Land 2. Now, I'm sure we all know what Kirby is at this point, but yes, the one thing I can say is that this was the game that introduced the animal friends, such as the fish, the owl, and Rick the hamster. I don't know why, I just think it's just so funny that they named the hamster Rick. Like, it's like the most random-ass name ever. So yeah, you know, just like every other Kirby game, I really like it. It's just a fun, chill platformer with some nice visuals and some great music, and of course the animal friends are overpowered as fuck. And as for number 16, we have is Battle Unit Zeoth. So this is a shoot 'em up where you're using a mech, and you can shoot in multiple directions, and it kind of reminds me of the game Beret Fighter on NES, which is a really good one. But yes, I really love the game's graphics in it. I think it's actually a really good-looking Game Boy game, and it has some really cool sprite work. Like, I like the main character sprite and all the bosses you get to fight. And it also has a pretty good soundtrack as well. But yeah, like I've been saying a lot, it's a very addicting game that's just very easy to pick up and play. Of course, the game itself isn't easy, but I do find it to be a pretty fun, challenging game. And at number 15, we have is Gargoyle's Quest. So this is a little spin-off series off of Ghosts and Goblins, and I gotta admit, I actually like this series so much better. So I do think it is kind of fun that, like, the main character that you're using is one of the random bad guys that you fight within Ghosts and Goblins. I do think the idea of that is kind of cool and fun. Like, imagine if there was a Mario game where the main character was a Koopa or a Goomba or something. Like, I don't know, I just like the idea of that. But anyways, I always really like the wall climbing in the game and being able to fly for a couple seconds. And as nice as these advantages are though, this game still manages to be pretty tough, but I do find it to be much more fair and forgiving than the main series. And another thing that does make this game pretty unique is that there's actually some top-down sections that look like an RPG, but it's more of an adventure mode section. And these sections in particular kind of remind me of Star Tropics, which I think is cool. But yeah, this is actually a really good version of the game, as I was kind of expecting this just to be like a not nearly as good version as, you know, the one on NES or the one on Super Nintendo, but no, it's actually quite good. And as for number 14, we have is Power Quest. Yeah, another game in a row with Quest in the name. So this is yet another pretty unique game on the Game Boy Color, where that it's a fighting game, but also mixed with an RPG. So you get to pick your robot you want to use, and you can customize them, and they all have their different movesets and whatnot, and then you just challenge other people. Now, I know fighting games on Game Boy and Game Boy Color were usually very, primitive, and I mean very primitive. Like, look at Mortal Kombat in Game Boy, like, holy shit, that was terrible. So yeah, unfortunately, the fighting game genre on handhelds at the time just really struggled. But of course, there were some that were actually not that bad, but then there's a lot of them that were just bad. But this one, however, actually was really, really good. And it's not just because of the RPG stuff. The actual combat feels really good, and also the button layout is very easy to figure out as, well, there's only 2 buttons and a D-pad, really, but yeah, like, it still feels really good to pull them off. It's quite impressive of how fast the game flows. So not only impressive and also kinda unique, but it actually is just a really good fun game on the Game Boy Color. And at number 13, we have is Miracle Adventure of S-Sparks. So this right here is a Japan-only game that I only found out about in recent times, and I have to say, this one was surprisingly really good. So you play as a knight where you shoot energy out of your sword, and you can actually change out to different projectile types. It sort of reminds me of Mega Man in some aspects. And I really like the graphics in this game. For a pretty early game on the Game Boy, it actually looks really, really good. And it has a catchy soundtrack as well. So yeah, this is one that I'm really glad that I found out about, because damn, it was definitely a good surprise. And as for number 12, we have is Wario Land. But which one am I gonna pick here? Because there's 3 of them. We got the first one, which is technically Mario Land, which is weird and confusing. And then there is 2 and 3 on Game Boy Color. And I have played them all, and it's kinda hard to pick a favorite because I think they're all pretty consistently good. But 2 is the one that I remember most fondly of, so I'm just gonna pick that one. But like I said, I think the other 2 are honestly just as good. So yeah, you get to play as Wario, and you get to shoulder charge the fuck out of people, which is always fun. And there's so many funny and unique animations that this game has, like whenever Wario gets hit by something, it's always really amusing. But probably one of the most strangest aspects that kinda works for the game is the fact that Wario can't die. Yeah, this guy's invincible. So you're probably thinking, what's the challenge of this game if you can't die? Well, it really has to do with the way that the levels are designed. So not only is there some parts that almost feel like a puzzle platformer where you gotta think outside the box to try to get past them, but also some of the boss fights have moments where they can have a chance of sending you back. So the way how they handled that is pretty unique. And like I keep saying, it's another chill yet easy game to pick up and play. And why not do it with Wario? And as for number 11, we have is Kid Dracula. So this is a bit of a quirky spin-off to the Castlevania games, and even though we missed out on getting the North American release of the Famicom version, we did get the Game Boy version. And for a long time, I never played the Game Boy version because I just assumed it was going to be some inferior version of the NES one, but surprisingly, it actually is a bit better. Not only do I think the game feels a bit more polished, but also the level designs are different, and I won't lie, I kinda like the way that they're done here better than the NES one. So yeah, Konami really knocked out of the park with this one. And as for number 10, we have is Tailgater. This is another game that I reviewed ages ago on the channel, and yeah, even going back to it to this day, I still really love this game. It's yet another very simple, easy to pick up and play platformer where you get to use an alligator and you have to tail whip other enemies, and you gotta go around opening up chests and collecting keys. And I really love the music in this game, it's just so upbeat and happy, I absolutely love it. So if you want a chill, short action platformer that's also kind of addicting, at least for me, I think this one is really, really good, and definitely worth playing. And as for number 9, we have is Pentadragon. this is a Japan-only one that I've also covered years ago on the channel. So it's a multi-directional shooter where you get to play as a dragon girl, and you do have an inventory for gaining like health items and whatnot. And this is another game that also does have a console version that was on the Super Nintendo, and yeah, believe it or not, I actually like the Game Boy version a lot better. I covered both of them in one video, so obviously I'm not going to go over like every differences here, but this is yet another game that was just very easy to pick up and play, and also I find to be very addicting. Like every time I completed a level, I didn't want to put it down. And as for number 8, we have is a Mega Man pick, and there's quite a few to pick from as they released 5 games in the Classic series, and then they released 2 X games on the Game Boy Color. And I believe there's a couple other random spin-offs as well, if I'm not mistaken. And I will say right off the bat, when it comes to the more earlier stuff on the Game Boy, they're very well made. Despite the fact that they have some screen crunching, they are actually very impressive well made for the Game Boy. But the one that I'm gonna go with here happens to be Mega Man Extreme. It's hard for me to pick which one I like more, Extreme 1 or 2, but I think both of them are very good, so we'll just say this is the Mega Man Extreme pick. So yeah, you know, it's basically just Mega Man X on the go, and I think it looks really good for Game Boy Color standards. It still has some really great music, and the difficulty is still there, although I do feel like that the screen crunching in this one is handled a lot better. Obviously it's not perfect, but compared to the earlier ones, I do think it is an improvement. But yeah, I don't think I really need to explain what Mega Man X is, and I'm sure we all played it before, or if you haven't, I'm sure you at least, know what it is. But I do really enjoy it for a handheld spin-off. And as for number 7, we have is Avenging Spirit. And this game right here is probably one of my favorite lesser-known games on the Game Boy. So the one weird thing I have to get out of the way with this game is that this is actually an arcade game that got ported to the Game Boy, but yet they didn't port it to anywhere else. Kinda strange. And obviously, the arcade version is way better, but for a Game Boy version, I actually think it's handled very well, and it's still very good. So this is a very unique action platformer where you get to play as a ghost, and your ability is to possess the people. Yeah, it's kind of like the game Geist on the GameCube, but as a platformer, and I really love that idea. So all the different things that you can possess into have different attacks and jumping and all that, so there's a lot of different play styles that you can play through the game with. I also really like the game's set pieces, and the different characters that you can possess also do look pretty cool. And it's just a very quirky, weird platformer that I just think worked really well on here. And like I said, I find it to be a very underrated game that doesn't get enough credit, I think. And it does kind of make me wish that we had more games with possession abilities, as I do feel like that they do open the floodgates to so many cool ideas. And as for number 6, we have is Fortified Zone. But to be exact, we're going to be talking about its Japan-only sequel, which is called Hikari no Yosai 2, which is the Japanese name, obviously. So I have played both, and they're both very good, but I do like the second one a bit more, for that I do think it does look a lot nicer. Also, the gameplay flow is a lot better as well. But the easiest way to sum up this game is that it's pretty much Contra meets Zelda, which is a pretty cool mixture, even though I do feel like this game does kind of remind me a lot of the game Guardian Legend, which I think is a really great NES game, so the fact that this game is kind of like that, I think is great. So yeah, it's a top-down game, you get to shoot at a bunch of stuff, you go through different mazes, and you gotta unlock different, doors and such. And you can switch between 2 different characters that have their differences, where one of them has more health, but is slower, and then the other one has less health, but they are faster, and they can also jump over things. So if you're like me and you really love Guardian Legend, then I would say this one is definitely worth a try. And as for number 5, we have is my Zelda pick. And this one's pretty tough for me to pick, as I do really like all of them on here, but the one that I really feel like talking about today happens to be Zelda Oracle of Seasons, which was the first handheld Zelda game I ever played. And for those that are wondering about ages, well, unfortunately, I barely played that one. I actually didn't know anyone that had it back in the day. But from the bit I did play of it, though, it did seem pretty good. But like I said, Seasons is the one that I grew up playing a lot of. And also, I really like the gimmick of being able to change the different seasons, and it changes up certain aspects. And I also really like the new characters that they added in for this game. I think they're all really cool and interesting. And I also do find it to be pretty fascinating that these games were actually developed by Capcom, and I think they nailed it. So yeah, we all know what Zelda is at this point, so there's not really a whole lot else I can say about it that hasn't been said before. But I do think it is a very good entry in the Zelda series in general, though. And as for number 4, we have is a Donkey Kong pick. And as you all know, Donkey Kong Country is one of my all-time favorite games ever made. So by that logic, you'd be thinking that I'd pick one of the land games. Well, guess what? I'm not. Instead, I'm just going to be picking the one that's called Donkey Kong. Yeah, what a great name that is. But this is pretty much the prototype version to the Mario vs. Donkey Kong games on the Game Boy Advance and onward. And it's still such a very good fun game, although one funny thing I have to mention that always makes me laugh about this game was that I remember the very first time I saw the cover for this game. Okay, well it was actually the cartridge art because, you know, no one I knew had the freaking boxes. Well anyways, the first time I saw the cover art, I was so shocked to see that, like, Mario was just so fucking pissed looking. Because you have to remember that back in the day, whenever I saw, like, cover arts for Mario games, like, he was always, like, happy and smiling, so just to see him just get so, like, pissed off looking, it's just so amusing and weird, but I kinda like it, though. So anyways, this game is pretty much just a remix version of the classic Donkey Kong arcade game, and it's done amazingly well. So when you first start the game, it looks just like the old one, but you'll notice right away that the flow of movement is different, and the fact that you can do backflips and such, which is really cool, is also a new thing. But then when you beat that section, the real game begins, where you actually get to do different worlds with many different levels and background settings, and it's all really great stuff. So yeah, like I've been saying a whole bunch of times, it's very simple, easy to pick up and play, and also very addicting. And even though I do really like the later Mario vs. Donkey Kong games, I still think that this prototype version is still very damn good and holds up well enough on its own. And as for number 3, we have is Operation C, basically Contra on Game Boy, and holy shit, this game was a lot better than I was expecting. So very similar to what I said about Kid Dracula, I never played this game until recent years, and it's mainly because I thought it was going to be some shittier version of the NES game, so I didn't bother with it. But man, I am so glad I played it, because it's pretty damn impressive. The gameplay speed is great, it doesn't feel like it slows down much at all, and the controls still feel really good, and also the soundtrack is just amazing. I really do think this game is almost on the same level as the first 2 games on NES. And you can't go wrong with those games, so yeah, the fact that it's almost at that level for me, yeah, I definitely love it. Alright, and as for number 2, we have is... Alright, before I say it, I'll just say that yes, it's a pretty obvious game that pretty much everyone I knew that had a Game Boy back then had at least one of these games, and that happens to be a Pokemon game. And which one am I picking today? Well, if you know me well enough, you know that it's gonna be one of the Gen 2 games, and that is Pokemon Crystal. In fact, Pokemon Crystal is actually the very first Pokemon game I ever owned. It's not the first one I ever played, but it's the first one that I actually owned and played the hell out of. But in case you're wondering what the first one I ever played was, that was Pokemon Yellow when my cousin had it, and he let me play it for a bit, and all I remember doing was walking around, getting into fights with wild Pokemon, and killing them with legendary Pokemon in one hit. But Crystal was the one that I got really invested into it. And it's not hard to see why, as tons of people are invested into them. But yeah, I don't think I really need to explain much, because, you know, I'm not gonna pull what the games do, where it's like, oh, this is how you catch Pokemon, this is what a Pokédex does, because, I mean, come on, we've done this shit like millions of times. But yeah, I have a lot of very fond memories with this game, I still listen to the game's soundtrack a lot. In fact, I actually prefer the Game Boy Color sound bit rather than the DS version. I mean, there are some tracks in the DS version that are good, but I still like all of them mostly consistent in the original form. But yeah, it's not really a surprise that one of these games is going to get mentioned, and yeah, no, I still really love it. Even though I've kind of fallen off from the Pokemon series for a long time now, I have still gone back and replayed this game a number of times, as it's just a really good chill RPG where you don't really gotta think about a whole lot of crap. As much as I do love RPGs that happen to have like a crazy story that you gotta wrap your head around, or the fact that there's RPGs that have these like crazy difficulty spikes and have crazy mechanics that you gotta like do these equipment bullshit type stuff, sometimes I'm just not in the mood for that and just want something that's simple and fun, like this game. So there you go, that's all I'm gonna say on Pokemon Crystal. And before we move on to the number 1 spot, we're going to be doing some honorable mentions, and like always, I can't mention everything because if I did, we'd be here forever, and besides, there's like a little over 1,000 games on the Game Boy, and well, last I checked, this is a top 30 list, not a top 1,000 list. So let's just get right to it. Cosmo Tank from Atlas, Dirty Racing, yeah, isn't that a funny name? the Game Boy version of DuckTales, Heiankyo Alien, the James Bond game that plays similar to Zelda, Maru's Mission, Spud's Adventure, which is my favorite game where you get to play as a potato, Super Bakurimon, the Takaman Blade game, Dinosaurs R Us is a very weird quirky one that only came out in Europe, Little Magic, Survival Kids, Top Gear Pocket 2, and the last one I'll mention, even though it's pretty damn obvious, would be Tetris, and really any other Tetris clone-style game that you can get on the Game Boy. And let's just get moving on. As for the last one we have is Mario Land 2 and the 6 Golden Coins. Yeah, you may just look at this and think it's just another average Mario game, but honestly, I really adore this game. In fact, this might actually be one of my favorite 2D Mario games. And there's a few good reasons for that. Firstly, is that I really love all the different level varieties that they have. There's a lot of really cool, unique settings that they've never, done in later games. Like, the Macro Zone is really awesome, that's probably one of my favorites. And then there's the Pumpkin Zone, which is really cool. And then there's also that giant mechanical Mario Zone, that one is pretty unique. Also, the space level was pretty interesting as well, even though, of course, now we have Mario Galaxy, which is basically just that. But still, seeing it in a 2D Mario game was still really cool. And the fact that Bowser is not the final boss of this game for like a million times is also just super refreshing, and I love that. And the fact that this was Wario's introduction, I just think is really awesome. And I did wish they included Wario into the more, platforming Mario games, as he seems like he's only in just the, the sports and the racing games. And I still remember the very first time that I finished this game was actually during school, and it felt great, because I never would have expected that I could ever beat a game during school. So yeah, not only is it one of my all-time favorite Mario games, but it's also just one of my all-time favorite Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. I just think it's just a hell of a good time that I never get tired of. And that'll be it for that. Those are 30 random games that I really love on this system. Now, if you did pay attention to some of these other ones that I've done, the last one that I did, I said that I was going to do the Dreamcast one next, and unfortunately I didn't end up doing it. I'm still trying to work it out, it's just there's two games that I really want to play and see if I like them enough to add in there before I fully do it, but it's just one of those things that's going to take a bit of time. But eventually, though, I will. So, as for the next one, I don't know. We'll see how things go. But I definitely do plan on continuing more of these, as they are fun to do, to kind of just look back on, everything I played on a system and see what I, liked and what I didn't like as much. And, it's just kind of fun. And hopefully some of you guys will have something new to play. So, with that being said, thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.